Okay, Roberto. So from the law enforcement side, you tend to say almost immediately, look, you can't blame law enforcement for everything. You can't
No.
and you can't expect that fixing law enforcement is going to fix everything.
No, but law enforcement can be blamed for some things. I think that we own certain actions that we've done historically, and we have to acknowledge that. We can't sit here and act like some of these things that occurred during the civil rights movement, prior, law enforcement oftentimes built out of runaway slaves being captured and brought back. That's some of the history of, quote, law enforcement. So we have to acknowledge that and understand how that sets us up for positions of distrust with oftentimes communities that we are supposed to serve. But I think what really bothers me is law enforcement is bearing the brunt of all societal issues right now because we're the most visible arm of government. You just heard Cheryl talk about Supreme Court decisions. Well, when the Supreme Court upholds certain actions, how is it that the police are the ones that are to blame and the police are the ones that are going to be castigated by the public saying, well, the police are doing this? This is because the direction of our justice system says, this is how we want police to act. This is acceptable. So we as police have to be leaders and say, okay, it may be legal, but is it right? And that's going to take a long time to turn. What D-Ray said, I agree. I think it can be done. It has to be done, but I don't think it's going to be done quickly.
So, DeRay, go on.
I just,
Roberto was saying something about structures in place, and you looked at me like,
I get that. I do get that the police have a very visible role when it comes to being public ambassadors, but there is something real. Those of us who were in Ferguson and in Baltimore and cities across the country, the police were violent in ways that was inexcusable, right? Like we shouldn't have been tear gassed or pepper balled or pepper sprayed or any of that stuff. And the police made an active choice every day to do that to us. And you think about places like Missouri where it was elite, people look back on us in Ferguson and they think that we marched in solidarity with the 60s because we thought marching was some cool thing to do. It was illegal to stand still in St. Louis in August of 2014 because the police thought that that was the best way to manage space. And we think about so many people that have been killed, like Tamir or Freddie or so many people, and I just won't accept this idea that the police were bearing the brunt when they did that. And it is hard because over the past 20 months, we haven't seen the police come to the table in a spirit saying that they have to change the culture of the police department in a real way. You're doing it here, which is important, but we have not seen that happen from active police chiefs across the country, who are in the role. We have not.
the truth is, Roberto, that you are here, and one of the first things that you're saying is the police have to own their responsibility.
In public.
But I'm not the
public.
first person. This is not the only place that has been said.
No, I
when I
understand.
was the chief
But there
of
are many
Tucson,
other
I'm
police
part of
who
major
will not
city
say
chiefs.
that,
Okay,
right?
but what I'm saying, there's a lot that do. And what worries me is that we paint with anecdotal brushes. I agree. What happened in Ferguson was inappropriate. It wasn't right. But I can tell you from my jurisdiction in Tucson, we escorted marchers for several days, for several miles, making sure they could safely exercise their rights. There was no tear gas used, there was no rubber bullets, there was nothing used. That occurred in jurisdiction after jurisdiction. But you don't hear those stories. All you hear about are the sensationalized ones that catch media attention, that show the lights, the dust, the smoke, and all of that.
Surely.
But you don't hear about the ones where it goes across with no problems and there's no issues there.
Okay.
Well, that's not
lack
part.
of balance, Sherilyn.
So, I'm going to go back to my original point, which is about structure. There has to be individual accountability for police officers who commit the kinds of acts that they committed in Ferguson, who killed Tamir Rice, who killed Freddie Gray. You can't have a young man, get in a police van, come out of a police van, and when the first EMT arrives on the scene and touches him, she says his neck felt like a bag of rocks. Somebody has to be responsible for that. So I get that. Mm-hmm. But what I also think is that we have to be responsible for the structure that we have created around that conduct that allows that conduct to happen. And so when I say the Supreme Court, I don't mean somewhere out there. I mean, who decided that the Ferguson Police Department should have military equipment, right? That was the civilian leadership of Ferguson applying to the Department of Homeland Security, as many small towns do all over this country, under the theory that we want to be able to combat terrorism, to obtain these kinds of materials that you would not expect police departments in a small town to have available to them. So we have to take responsibility for every level of structure. I do want to speak to this issue about what do we hear about, and the good and the bad cops, and and those who are trying to, because of course, nobody would suggest that all cops are 100% bad. No one would suggest that there are not cops who are not trying to do the right thing. I actually worry that many of the police chiefs who have tried to tell the truth are the ones who end up being fired. So that's real. But there is a narrative about the police in this country that actually goes forth every day that actually has nothing to do with what we saw in Ferguson. Right now, we're talking somewhere Law and Order is on television. You know this, right? It's on 20 hours a day. There's a constant media narrative that has been for decades about how awesome the police are, about how they're heroes, about, even when they break the law and they punch the guy, it's to get at the truth. I mean, we have a narrative that's positive about police. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have one. I'm just saying the current narrative, the one that's been underground in minority communities about the excesses of police, it's time for that narrative to be on stage so that we can put these two stories together and recreate what we really want law enforcement to look like.
And it's uncritical.